Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frata Eleftheria, and this video is going to look into the ancient origins of the religion practiced by the Israelites in the Old Testament and investigate whether that form of religion actually originated in ancient Egypt. And so this is going to be a very intriguing video that covers a range of different topics and little clues within ancient Israelite religion that point to an Egyptian origin. So stick around for that. You know, I tend to venture between sort of talking about Western esotericism and occultism on this channel, and sometimes venturing into talking about, you know, the kind of mainstream exoteric religions of Christianity and Judaism. And that can often be polarizing. You know, if I talk about the occult, people say, oh, you need Jesus. You know, you should be not talking about this stuff because it's incompatible with believing in the Bible. And then on the other side, when I talk about biblical religion, you know, people say, oh, why are you talking about this? You should just talk about occultism. Talking about Christian or Judeo-Christian topics is somehow mutually exclusive with esoteric religion. And, you know, I've done some videos kind of trying to demonstrate that the truth is more complicated than that, and that there is a lot of kind of interrelationship between, you know, the Western esoteric tradition as it stretches back down through the centuries and the kind of main monotheistic religions that we think of today. This video is sort of in that same vein. There is a misunderstanding about how the monotheistic faiths of today came into existence. Particularly when you talk to Christians about this, they seem to have this misconception that the belief in the one God was just this completely new thing that dropped out of the sky, was not influenced by anything that went before, and that's it. And then everything else that existed before then was just evil, and it was a form of devil worship, and all, you know, forms of pagan religion were devil worship, and all pagan societies were irredeemably wicked. And it's really just a simplistic way of looking at things. In fact, if we look at the reality of the situation, what we call today monotheism gradually emerged out of paganism and built upon its wisdom in a different direction. And we see the same thing with the ancient Israelite religion that is described in the Old Testament. There's a couple of different influences on that. There are some Babylonian influences, which I'm not going to talk about today because it's off topic. But there is a very noticeable big influence on Israelite religion from ancient Egypt. In fact, I would go so far as to say that all of the most important kind of elements of ancient Israelite religion, or at least most of them, come from ancient Egypt. And I'm going to give 8 examples which demonstrate how the Israelite religion, the religion described in the Old Testament in the Bible, actually came from ancient Egypt. And there's even more ancient Egyptian influence on the development of the Christian religion, but that is a topic for another time. So first, there is the influence of ancient Egypt on Moses. This is probably the most overt example of Egyptian influence on the Israelites. Moses, of course, was raised Egyptian. He was a prince of Egypt in the Exodus story, and he then went into exile and was given a new calling by God. And even when he came back to Egypt to challenge Pharaoh, there's some stuff that happens in the Exodus story which kind of implies that Moses had knowledge of some of the Egyptian mysteries, most notably when he's challenging the magicians of the Pharaoh. The miracles of Moses mirror the magic spells that are done by the Egyptian priests, almost as though they're reading from the same magic spell book, which has led some to conclude that Moses was indeed an initiate of the Egyptian mystery schools. And given his status in Egyptian society, he would certainly have access to that knowledge. But it's an interesting kind of suggestion from reading the text of Exodus. And another connection, of course, with ancient Egypt is that Moses' own name, Moshe, seems to be Egyptian rather than Hebrew. It's very similar to the Egyptian word Mos, which often appears in other ancient Egyptian names, such as Tutmos, and what it really means is child of, and it'll have a prefix which is the name of a god, so it's to say that somebody is the child of, or the devoted follower of a particular god. And of course, in Moses' name, there is no God's name before his, perhaps reflecting the fact that the name of the God of Israel was not known in the times of the bondage of the Hebrews in Egypt. But all of this suggests a very strong Egyptian influence on Moses himself, not just in terms of his upbringing, but perhaps even his kind of religious practices that he brought with him. Next, there's the 10 Commandments. So we have the list of 10 Commandments, the main kind of commandments. This list is actually very similar to another list of moral principles to be followed, which appears in an ancient Egyptian text known as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is a spell book that was designed to give the soul entering the afterlife a number of spells with which to navigate the afterlife and avoid being devoured and actually make their way to eternal life. And the 42 negative confessions are things that the soul of that person had not done during life that would entitle them to eternal life. And if you look at the transgressions in the negative confessions, they are very, very similar to what appears in the 10 Commandments. And given that the sort of material that would form the Book of the Dead appeared towards the end of the Middle Kingdom, which was, before even the earliest possible date for Exodus, it would seem that there is some kind of an influence from the 42 negative confessions on the 10 Commandments. So this is a very interesting sort of thing to think about, particularly when you consider the role of the 10 Commandments and following the 10 Commandments in later Christian tradition as being part of the thing that ensures eternal life in the kind of Christian narrative. But we have something similar going all the way back to ancient Egypt. But the 10 Commandments are not the only commandments that appear in the first 5 books of the Bible. There are, in fact, 613 commandments, in Hebrew known as the mitzvot. And a number of these mitzvot actually appear to have been influenced by ancient Egyptian practices as well. So, for example, pork is an unclean meat in the mitzvot, and it was also the case in ancient Egypt. In the mitzvot, there is a prohibition upon the people of Israel wearing garments that consisted of wool mixed with linen, with the exception of the priesthood. And in ancient Egypt, there was also a perception that wool was undesirable in most circumstances. Most ancient Egyptians were expected to wear linen clothing, but there was an exception for the more kind of elite in Egyptian society who could wear a little bit of wool, and the priesthood would have been among that elite. There is an overall emphasis on ritual purity in the mitzvot, which also is something that was emphasized by the priests in ancient Egypt, particularly when it comes to physical cleanliness before stepping into a ritual. There are certain types of relationships between certain types of people that are forbidden in the mitzvot, which were also seen as sinful by the Egyptian priesthood, and even appear in some versions of the negative confessions. And many of the rules and regulations of the mitzvot in the part of the Pentateuch which deals with all of that has to do with ritual tools that are to be used in the worship of the one God. So, for example, there are specific recipes for the holy anointing oil that is to be used by the priests to anoint various things related to the worship of God, as well as appointing priests and kings. And there is a specific recipe for the holy incense that is to be burnt as an offering before God. And if you look at the recipe of both of these, this oil and incense, then they have very similar ingredients to Egyptian oils and Egyptian incenses that were used in ritual. So in the case of the oil, cinnamon and myrrh form part of the basis of that. And we also see those two ingredients used in ancient Egyptian oils. Similarly, the incense makes use of frankincense and myrrh as some of the most important ingredients, and we see these two incenses being very important in ancient Egyptian religion as well. And also, intriguingly, the Ark of the Covenant, the sort of golden box which housed the commandments and the rod of Aaron and the manna from heaven that appears in the Old Testament, seems to have been inspired, again, by ancient Egyptian religious forms. The Ark of the Covenant is likely to be based on an Egyptian bark, which is a very similar kind of item that was used in ancient Egyptian worship. It was a box, sometimes on top of a boat, sometimes not, because the bark referred to the bark that the sun god travelled on during the day. But there was this golden box in various different forms, which had kind of, on either side of it, it had handles protruding out that could be held to carry the box into the temple where it would be laid. And this is very similar to the design of the Ark of the Covenant. And the sacred Egyptian bark was meant to be a shrine for the presence of a particular god, embodied in the case of Egyptian religion in an idol, a kind of a statue of the god. Of course, that doesn't translate across to the Israelite religion, but it did contain other items which were significant to the worship of the one God. And this brings me to my next point, which is looking at the temple that was built in Jerusalem and its predecessor, the tabernacle, as described in the Pentateuch. This kind of form of place of worship seems to have been influenced by an Egyptian design. So if you look at the setup of an ancient Egyptian temple, there's kind of an outer courtyard, and then there's an inner hall, and then within that there is an even more inner sanctum, which is where the sacred bark was laid to rest. And there are two pillars at either side of the entrance to the temple. This is very similar to the way that the tabernacle and the temple in Jerusalem were constructed, with an outer courtyard and then the kind of entrance to the temple with the two pillars, and then a kind of holy place, and then within that, a Holy of Holies, which is where the Ark of the Covenant, the equivalent to the Egyptian bark, was placed. This inner sanctum in ancient Egyptian religion was known as the djeser-djeseru. In the Israelite shrine, it was the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Both of these terms translate to the same term in English, which is Holy of Holies. The next Egyptian influence we see on Israelite religion is in its influence on the Hebrew language. In one of my previous videos on Gematria, I spoke about how the Hebrew language actually came from an earlier language known as Phoenician, and the Phoenician language came from an even earlier language which was spoken in the sort of Canaanite region known as the proto-sinaitic language. A written alphabet, perhaps the oldest written alphabet in the world, with phonetic sounds as opposed to a hieroglyphic language, that is. And in terms of the origin of the proto-sinaitic alphabet, the characters that were used for each sound, for each letter, find their origin point in the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. That's not to say that each hieroglyph was used for the equivalent sound in the new proto-sinaitic script, but those symbols were the inspiration for the letters of the proto-sinaitic script. And then these very rudimentary letters kind of developed and evolved and became more abstract to eventually become the Hebrew alphabet. Now this has some interesting implications. When you read what the great rabbis and sages and Kabbalists say about the Hebrew language, particularly when we think of Rabbi Akiva, who said that every shape of every letter has a significance to it. And the kind of archetypal energy of each letter has a significance to it. So ultimately, those archetypal forms would originate in the ancient Egyptian language. And another thing that is interesting with kind of the Hebrew kind of attitudes towards the use of language and the Egyptian attitudes is they're very similar in terms of what they see as the power of the word in a context of religion and particularly magic. So in both Egyptian mythology and in ancient Israelite mythology, creation was brought into being by God or a god speaking forth a word. It was, of course, Yahweh in the case of Israelite religion. It was Ptah in Egyptian religion. But this is something that makes those two unique. And we see in ancient Egypt, this is the place where much of the magic in the ancient world came from. And it was very centered around incantations and prayers. In other words, the use of the word in a creative way, almost in a godlike way. And similarly, in Jewish magic, which comes down from Israelite religion, obviously, again, we see an emphasis on the power of magic words and magical names as the basis of the magic. So both religions have a concept of the sacredness of the language that is being spoken in that religion, and the letters of that language also having a special sanctity to them, related to the symbolic use of the word. Another way that Egyptian religion potentially influenced Israelite religion is with the concept of monotheism. So the Jewish or the Israelite practice of monotheism did not come out of nowhere. It was not an original idea, and it was not something that was always a feature of Israelite religion. Monotheism sort of developed over time out of a previous Israelite religion, which was very similar to the Canaanite religion, which was polytheistic and included gods such as Baal and Asherah and El Elyon and so forth. Again, a video for another time. But eventually, at least one strand of Jewish belief, which practiced a belief in one God, became dominant, and then it developed further as it interacted with other cultures, and that is the origin of Jewish monotheism. And there are two possibilities that are taken seriously as the potential origin point of Jewish monotheism. One is in Zoroastrianism, which divided the world into two spiritual camps of good and evil, with the god Ahura Mazda representing absolute good in much the same way as the Israelite god does. And the second possibility is that it actually came from ancient Egypt in the form of the worship of Aten as the one god. Now, the argument for the Zoroastrian origins of Jewish monotheism can be linked to the time spent in exile in Babylon, which then became part of the Persian Empire in ancient times, that is, of the Jews spending that time in exile and being exposed to Zoroastrian customs, and perhaps importing monotheism as a result of that. The problem with that is that Zoroastrianism, if you investigate it closely, is not actually true monotheism. It's actually a form of dualism, because you've got Ahura Mazda, the absolute god of the good, but the polarity opposing that god, Angra Mainyu, the god of evil, is an equally matched principle in the universe. And this does not match with Jewish belief, which is pure monotheism. And even evil, the principle of evil within Jewish belief, is something that is subservient to God. And we see this in the way that the character of Ha-Satan, or Satan in Judaism, is different even to Christianity, where Satan is not in rebellion against God, but ultimately serves God's purposes and cannot do anything and test humankind without permission from God. So that leaves Atenism as the potential source of monotheism for Israelite religion. And there is some compelling evidence to suggest that this is the case. Of course, ancient Egyptian religion was polytheistic for most of its history, but there was a time in history where the pharaoh Amenhotep changed his name to Akhenaten and introduced a new cult to Egypt as the official religion of Egypt, which was the cult of Aten, the sun god. And what made Atenism unique in ancient Egyptian history was that it prescribes the worship of one supreme god and no other gods besides that one god. And this was something that was revolutionary in ancient pagan societies, and ultimately the revolution of Atenism was wound back and polytheism restored. But there was this moment in time where the idea of monotheism emerged for the first time in ancient history, and it was in ancient Egypt. And another thing that is interesting about when Atenism came on the scene is it's very close in time to the period when the Exodus is said to have happened. So some people have tried to draw a connection between the two in a much more kind of direct way. I think there needs to be more research to confirm that, but there is certainly an argument to be made that the monotheism of Akhenaten may have indeed influenced the adoption of monotheism by the Israelites, which is one of the most important, if not the most important feature of the entire Israelite religion. The final connection between ancient Egypt and ancient Israel that I would like to talk about is in some of the wisdom literature of ancient Israel, the stuff that sort of comes after the Torah, the first 5 books. We actually see in at least 2 cases that there is a very direct parallel between some of the verses in the Old Testament and hymns that were written in ancient Egypt. So Psalm 104 is very similar to the great hymn to Aten. There's Aten again, interestingly. And Proverbs 22 to 17 to 24:22 is very similar to the instruction of Amenenepe. And both of these texts in the Bible were written in the period where Israel had been well established in the land and had kings even. So it just goes to show that the influence of ancient Egypt continued on for quite late into Israel's history. So when we take all of these examples together, we can see that there is indeed a very big influence of ancient Egyptian religion on Israelite religion. Granted, it's not the only influence, but it is a major influence without which Israelite religion would not exist in the way that it existed when it influenced modern monotheism. And Egyptian religion also influenced the Greeks in a number of ways as well. But I think it's really profound to see the level of detail with which ancient Egyptian religious practices seem to have informed ancient Israelite religious practices. Now that we've established the connection, what is the implication of this? I think the implication is that Judaism, as the inheritor of the ancient Israelite tradition, is part of a continuation of what is in turn a much older tradition in the form of ancient Egyptian religion. In the Old Testament, we get a lot of emphasis on Abraham and the descent of the Israelites from Abraham as being the source of what makes that people special in their role of bringing light and bringing blessings to all nations. But what if it's not so much to do with lines of descent, but the kind of knowledge that is passed down by this line, that is the thing that allows it to bring blessings to the nations? And what if the sacred teachings of the Egyptians are an untold part of that story and the ultimate cradle from which these teachings were then passed down to the descendants of Abraham? Egypt features a lot in the story of the Old Testament, and not just when you consider the Hebrews being enslaved for 400 years. Abraham travels to Egypt with his wife Sarah. Joseph is taken to Egypt and rises to become the Grand Vizier of Egypt in the book of Genesis. And from the 16th to 11th centuries BC, which includes the early years of the Israelite period, the land of Canaan was part of the Egyptian Empire. It was actually a part of Egypt. So we see a lot of links between Egypt and the children of Israel, the children of Abraham. What if part of God's plan for preparing the people of Israel for their mission of bringing blessing to the world was to expose them to the wisdom of the Egyptians so they could learn from it and ultimately build upon it? The implications of that are immense because it suggests that ancient Egypt and the wisdom of Egypt is the origin point for the exoteric and esoteric wisdom that we find predominating in the Western world today, as well as in the Islamic world. So that is quite a legacy to leave behind. But what sort of an implication does this Egyptian influence have on the view of the monotheistic faiths that their origin point, through the origin of ancient Israelite religion, is as a tradition based on revelation? If this knowledge came from Egypt, does it then follow that it was not in fact revealed directly by God, as we are told in the narrative of the revelation at Mount Sinai? Well, I don't necessarily think that the two are mutually exclusive. The wisest Jewish scholars had a more sophisticated understanding of divine revelation than just one of divine intervention that was completely arbitrary. For example, Maimonides understood that prophets like Moses, as part of their preparation to become prophets, needed to go through a process of rational and intellectual refinement. They needed to learn about the kind of ideologies and beliefs of their own time. So who's to say that God couldn't point to a pre-existing source of divine knowledge and say that that is something to be carried on or something to be improved upon, and to create a higher standard of morality than what went before? It's quite possible that divine revelation could occur in that way as well. And I think that that's kind of what's happened here. We might see the process of divine revelation as a gradually unfolding process of God revealing God's presence to us, God's plan to us bit by meeting us where we are in a culture at any given time, and then helping us get a little bit further towards understanding God and the mystery of God, until we're ready to go a little bit further again, and so on. You think about the idea of progressive revelation in the Baha'i faith. Perhaps this is what is really going on here. And perhaps the beginnings of when we started to ask the questions that would help us to understand that great divine mystery can be placed, at least in recorded history, in the ancient Egyptian civilization. So I hope I've left you some food for thought in this video. I've covered a lot of material. You can feel free to research any aspect of that further if you want to go deeper into this. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and it creates a much more complicated picture of where we come from as a civilization. If you enjoyed it, please like the video, subscribe to my channel to support my work, and if you want to support me further, hit join or thanks down below. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.